just had something go right over the top of us that looked like a long cylindrical object that almost looked like a cruise missile type of thing moving really fast. We just had something go right over the top of us that looked like a long cylindrical object that almost looked like a cruise missile type of thing moving really fast.
Hello again, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. And today we are covering a great topic, and I'm sure many people are interested in: the moon. We start with some facts. The moon is Earth's only permanent natural satellite. It's the fifth largest natural satellite in the solar system and the largest among planetary satellites relative to the size of the planet that it orbits.
So it's, in terms of the planet it orbits, it's the biggest?
It's the biggest, yes.
Right.
The moon is the second densest satellite, so it's not a gaseous moon. The moon always shows Earth the same face, so the moon is in synchronous rotation with Earth. Its near side is marked by large dark plains, volcanic light, that fill the spaces between the bright ancient crystal highlands and the prominent impact craters.
So what we call the dark side of the moon really means the moon side we never see.
The moon's surface is actually dark, so it's not grey or white sand or beach sand or anything. It's a dark kind of maybe a volcanic greyish colour. The moon is drifting away from Earth by 3.8 centimetres annually every year. The moon was made when the rock smashed into Earth, apparently, but that even some people have questions about that. That might be a conspiracy in itself. But.
Well, I think in a lot of ways there's sort of 3 or 4 possible theories. It depends on which scientist likes which. Nobody really knows where the moon comes from, let's put it that way.
Exactly. The moon makes the Earth move as well as the tides, so the gravitational pull of the moon at its strongest point to Earth doesn't only just pull the water along with it, it kind of pulls everything else. So the gravitational, it's so probably like
atmospheric pressure and things like that.
Yeah, atmospheric pressure. When the moon orbits the Earth, it also causes a tide of rock to rise and fall in the same way as it does with water.
You're kidding?
Well, that's what the facts are saying. The effect is not
so it actually affects the mantle and the lava.
Yeah.
Sorry, the magma. Rather.
Yeah. The gravitation pull is so strong.
Shape
tries
of
to
the
lift
Earth.
it. Yeah.
So it's kind of like an egg shape pointing towards.
Yeah.
So in actuality, when they talk about the equator and the distance of it, it depends where the moon is.
Yeah, from the information I have, the effect is not as dramatic as with oceans, but nevertheless it is a measurable effect, with the solid surface of the Earth moving by several centimetres with each tide. Which is quite amazing.
Yes, that is amazing.
Well, I never knew that
relative to the centre of the Earth.
Yeah, very interesting. The moon has earthquakes as well. So
moonquakes, I've heard of that.
Yeah, they're called moonquakes, yeah. They're caused by the gravitational influence of Earth. So it's not something like a tectonic plate moving. It's the gravitational influence of Earth pulling back at the moon causes the quakes.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Moonquakes can last up to half an hour, and they are much weaker than earthquakes.
Right, so they're like a microquake kind of thing.
A micro. And there is water on the moon. There is water at the poles of the moon. In regards to humans and human history in relationship to the moon, the humans used to build structures. For instance, there's a Neolithic stone circles in Scotland, pyramids in Mexico. It's a platform for public rituals and sacrifices in Teotihuacan, Mexico. So humans have revered it and used it for varying purposes, obviously to idolize it as a god and offer ritual sacrifices to it and so forth. So yeah, it's always been held in high regard in history through many cultures, not just Mexico and Scotland, but all around the world. First observations of the moon began with the British scientist Thomas Harriot, and he sketched the first known drawing of the moon from observations he made with a homemade telescope back on July the 26th, 1609. So that was quite a long time ago, so I would suspect the telescope's quite rudimentary back then.
I reckon so.
It was just like a concave glass at the end of a stick with a hole. Then Galileo then would begin his revolutionary study of the Earth companion a few months later. With his rudimentary telescope as well, he watched shadows move and change on the surface during the moon's 29.5 day cycle. And that's where we started to garner information and scientific study of the moon. Probably best get into what the discussion is about, conspiracy behind the moon. Did we actually go? Do you want to start us off?
Well, I was just going to say, if you think back to even the earliest of cinema, firing people out of cannons into a cheese moon,
Into the Moon's Eye, yeah, it's a
right.
black and white film. It's
Kind
quite
of thing.
famous thing, yeah.
The idea that when they first started to realise it was a celestial body, of course the first question was, well, how far away is it? How do we get there? And how far away is it? Well, it's about 384,000 kilometres away, which is a long way.
Not round the corner if you haven't got a form of transport to get you there.
Exactly,
Really.
exactly. So the first thing to say about the moon landing, if we just go back to the beginning of NASA, Operation Paperclip was essentially bringing German scientists. I'm not going to call them Nazis because they were just scientists. They weren't politically motivated. And they,
For the most part, some of them must have been. But
maybe some of them, but in terms of, they were just German scientists, and they were brought over to America, and they lived in the middle of Nevada, and they hated it. It was burning hot, and they kept them in like sort of caravans in a pretty much like
that was
the
their hell
Germans-
for their sins.
The Germans did to everyone else. They kept them basically in a concentration camp, but they did give them stuff like food and water, so it wasn't too bad. But they were stuck out there in the middle of nowhere with no contact. I think they had their families with them, if I remember correctly. And they were there because, of course, the Americans took a lot of the V2 missiles.
It's very interesting you mentioned the V2 missiles that the Americans took. Our concept of rockets originated, you know, those famous early sketches and drawings and movie pictures from the 30s and 40s and so forth originated from the V2 rocket. So remember Tintin had that big rocket, red rocket, that was originated from the V2.
Well, it looks very much like a V2.
Yeah.
I mean,
So,
it basically began, there was a guy called Robert P. Goddard, who was an American. And in 1914, he patented a multi-stage liquid-fueled rocket that could get into orbit. He patented that, even though he had no way he could build it. Then, this was 10 years before 15 years before the jet engine was invented. Bear that in mind. That's how primitive rocketry really is.
They're more primitive than that because they were invented in China.
Well,
Really?
fireworks.
Fireworks.
Well, that's what a rocket is. It's
Yeah.
a firework,
It's
after
a
all.
big firework, yeah.
So, von Braun was very impressed with Goddard. He was a big inspiration, and von Braun was looking into rockets well before the Second World War. And obviously, he used the funding as an opportunity to, reach his dream. Of course, he had to. They put warheads in it, which he wasn't so keen on, but he was interested in the rocket. Even before that, Jules Verne was writing about space travel and escape velocity. Newton talked about being in orbit. He talked about the idea of falling around the world.
Right.
Even that was in Principia Mathematica, which was the 17th century. So the idea of orbit was around even then. All these ideas were coming together. The Americans did have V2s for 25 years before they did this. So you bear in mind, they had a lot of time. So they had the Mercury and the Gemini programs. So
Obviously, we've just discussed the rockets, and those are the inspiration for the Apollo mission. And obviously, we're going to mainly focus our discussion today around the Apollo mission and did it really happen, and what are the conspiracy theories that people have garnered throughout the years. I mean, the first conspiracy theory I have is the shadows on the moon landing photos prove the images were faked. Does it? Does it not prove that? Well, I mean, what's your opinion on that?
there's a difference between the footage and the photos and whether or not they went. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
I can think of all sorts of reasons they'd have to fake the photos. So, is that even a question about whether they went or not? What I was going to say first of all was perhaps we should begin with Kennedy.
Okay.
If you think about that film JFK, that film begins with Eisenhower talking about a military technological elite, and that there's a danger they will control everything, which in my mind, and the look on his face, means they already control everything. This is before Kennedy even... And he says, and the danger will persist, and what he means is it's going to get worse. These people are all powerful, they don't have health and safety regulations, they tell me what to do, and I'm the President of the United States. That's basically what I read into what Oliver Stone's saying with that opening film. Because there's more to that film, because he focuses on the assassination, but there's more to that film. What he's really talking about is, because he shows that speech that Kennedy gives about the moon.
Yeah, but I just want to go back quickly to what you said about Eisenhower.
Yes.
You know, Eisenhower was one of the greatest American heroes. You know, he led the Allied forces in World War II. He was their most trusted commander, and then obviously he naturally progressed into politics and became a president quite easily because obviously everyone believed in him. So for someone of that caliber to come out and talk against the actual people that were supplying him weapons and helping him win those wars, for him to actually come out and say something against them, it must mean something. It's got to. I don't know why it did not have enough impact back then. The guy that is reliant on this military-industrial complex is now telling you not to trust them.
But bear in mind that he didn't do anything until his departing speech, and this guy was a war hero.
Yes,
and not just a hero, a general.
That just shows fear, doesn't it? It shows the amount of
It
power
just
they
goes to
have.
show that he was completely under control of a technological elite. After that, Kennedy comes along and tries to ramp it up.
Yes.
And of course, the conspiracy theory I'm talking about is that Kennedy proposed publicly that they were going to land on the moon without running it by this technological elite, because he believed they would have to disclose anti-gravity technology that Witten and all these other guys were developing in the 50s at McDonnell Douglas, and that they would have to tell the people that they had this technology, and the moon landings would be a way for them to do it, to develop it openly. And that's basically what Kennedy called their bluff. And of course the theory goes on that they were like, no way no way, Jose, we're going to kill this guy. And that's what happened. Of course, the thing about Kennedy is everybody wanted him dead. The bankers wanted him dead, the generals wanted him dead, the Vietnam guys, the guys who wanted to end communism, so all the bankers, everybody wanted Kennedy dead. It's another part of that. It doesn't prove anything. It's not even evidence towards it. But it certainly does fit, because let's face it, we've never been back.
No, but I think I think you raised a really good point. I think it's a good place to start, right at the beginning, where the conspiracy started right from its conception, in the sense that it was an idea thought out originally. This is obviously hearsay, but it's an idea thought out originally to show the world that we have technology that they couldn't even fathom at the time.
He must have made that speech earlier. He must have made it in 60 or 60, because they started Apollo in 61,
right?
Didn't they?
Yeah.
So he must have made it at 60 or 61. So that's the beginning, as you say. And
so from its conception, we can say that it was never designed to work.
That's first problem number one. They went from nothing to landing on the moon in less time than it took Elon Musk to land on a platform. That's how quickly Apollo happened. From Kennedy announcing it, they were on the moon 8 years later, because obviously that just goes towards it. He gave them less than a decade to get to the moon. He wanted them to disclose.
Yes.
Do you see what I'm saying with that?
I see the angle you're coming from.
I mean,
it's interesting
it really fits together when you think of it that way. When you look at the Eisenhower speech and what Kennedy did, because Kennedy was from a weird guy. He came from like a family. His father was quite a questionable, criminal kind of weird guy, but his sons hated him for it. So they both died too. He was also, the mafia. He pissed the mafia off. He pissed everyone off. He was obviously, if you look at it as this is a possible truth, he wanted to change things in his lifetime.
He was a disruptor. He knew he was a disruptor, but the world needed shaking up. So he needed them.
Well, and I think he had communication with Khrushchev.
Yes, he did. He had secret lines open behind channels, which even the CIA weren't aware of at the time, and the KGB weren't officially aware of, and they were very upset about. The two of them had a secret line just to stave off these kind of threats of war and talk and have some sort of dialect behind the scenes.
So if you think about that, that means that the Bay of Pigs was completely orchestrated by other people.
It's a strong possibility, yeah.
Because if Kennedy was talking to Khrushchev, who put the missiles in Turkey right next to Russia? That can't have been Kennedy.
It was our friends in the military-industrial complex. The CIA, yeah. The two of them.
And then there's the KGB, and they must have... And this was all to try and invade Cuba. That was their plan.
Yeah.
And they tried to trick Kennedy into doing it.
He got caught out.
And he got caught out.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a fascinating idea that even the president's got almost no power.
It's frightening, to be honest with you.
Whatsoever.
That elected officials aren't really have any gravity on any decisions that are made, and that's quite frightening. But
So
I mean,
he tried to force them by using the public. He went public with an idea in a time frame. Because when you think about that time frame is absurd.
that's just
It's
unrealistic.
just absolutely ridiculous.
For something that's never been done before, and you haven't got any, previous knowledge of.
And then NASA couldn't just turn around and go, "Oh, I can't do that. That's ridiculous."
Not at that time, because obviously in the middle of the Cold War, it's an idealistic war, isn't it?
Now, the more I think about that suggestion of a theory, a conspiracy theory, it just seems so... It just explains everything that happened.
Yeah, well, shall we get started with some conspiracy theories now?
Well, I think that's conspiracy number one.
Yeah.
Is that they faked it because they didn't want to disclose, so they faked it and killed Kennedy to get rid of him, because he was the only person that would have said, well, he would have just said he didn't go.
And it's a really interesting theory, and with the knowledge I have, it makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense.
It makes a lot of sense.
I have to say that
to me,
saying it here and now today, it's making more sense than it's ever made before.
Yeah.
To me.
Yeah.
It really is.
Yeah.
But let's go on. So let's get on to some of the facts about the actual mission. So before we even get to the moon landing, let's talk about the journey.
Yes.
Because as far as I'm concerned, having looked at the pattern they were planning to do and the orbit and everything they were planning to use, Saturn V makes perfect sense.
It does, yeah.
It's definitely the vehicle. I mean, it's a mad vehicle. If you think about the fact that they built a vehicle so massive, Saturn V still carries more into space than Falcon Heavy.
Yeah.
By about 50% more. There's no rocket on Earth operating today as big as Saturn V. Saturn V was huge. It was 3 stages essentially. So the first stage got you into low
Earth orbit. The first stage.
One of the second,
beyond that.
The first and second stage got into low Earth orbit. Then the second stage burned again to get you into escape velocity, I think.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you've jettisoned it all and you're off in escape velocity towards the moon. And of course, you slow down the whole way towards the moon because of Earth's gravity until you get about 90%, 85% of the way there, and then you start to speed up again because of the moon's gravity.
So the velocity is 2.38 kilometers per second for Earth. For the Earth, that's the speed you need to attain, the velocity you need to attain to escape Earth's orbit, to get out of Earth's orbit and head towards the moon.
No, it's 11.2 kilometers a second.
11.2 kilometers.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
2.38 is the moon's.
2.38 is the moon. Yeah. So they would have been coming into the moon. This is a very confusing idea, but when you come into a celestial body with enough velocity and get into its orbit, it actually slingshots you round and fires you back out again. It doesn't manage to hold you the whole way.
Oh, so it won't hold you for the whole circumference.
So they had to slow down. Once they were coming into the moon hot, if you like, because the moon's gravity's been speeding them up for the last sort of 12 hours, well, probably 10 hours, they had to slow down. So they're using even more rocket fuel. So you're coming in at probably 2 or 3 kilometres a second. You've got to get down to less than 2 safely. Even more fuel, even more danger, but then you're into the moon's orbit safely. Now, all of that, fundamentally, is possible. There's only one really big problem, and that is the radiation belt.
Yeah, the Van Allen belt.
The Van Allen radiation belt.
Yeah.
The Van Allen radiation belt, no one's ever traversed except the moon, guys, unless they've done it in a completely different kind of vehicle. Because to get enough radiation shielding into orbit was completely beyond the capability of Saturn V.
You require lead to really protect you from that level of radiation, and that's not feasible.
Realistically,
for a
meter of lead.
Yeah.
And just to be totally clear, they weigh about the same. I mean, you're talking about something that would have multiplied the weight of the command module by maybe over 100 times.
It's just not fathomable to lift off from
you
that.
would have had a space rocket the size of the Empire State
Yeah,
Building.
you might have been able to launch an aircraft carrier
Exactly.
into space. Yeah.
It would have been impossible.
Interesting.
So that's a really big problem. Now, of course, what they say nowadays is, they were going through it too fast, it didn't matter. Now, at 11.2 kilometres a second, you are going very, very fast indeed. So you're only going to be within the Van Allen radiation belt for, well, it's 1,000 kilometres deep, max. I mean, the really dangerous bit is about 500 to 1,000 kilometres up.
Right.
So you'd be through it in
an hour or two.
No, you'd be through it in seconds.
Really? That quickly?
You'd
I
be
suppose
at
it would.
11.2 kilometres per second.
Per second, right.
You'd be through it in 50 seconds.
Yeah, but it's enough. It's a high enough dose of radiation that 50 seconds exposure is enough to really cause some level of.
I reckon it would blind you.
Yeah.
Unless you. But then they might have had eye protection. It's not impossible, but no one else has ever tried it. No,
And no one else has tried it since, have they?
No.
I mean, we've had many unmanned spacecraft.
Well, that's a serious problem, because when you watch the NASA videos now, they're talking about Orion.
Artemis,
that's right.
Yes.
They're talking about when he draws the thing, he draws the Van Allen radiation belt, and he says an area of dangerous radiation. Well, what happened
How are you going
last
to
time?
counter that? Yeah.
What happened last time, buddy?
Yeah.
You know, nowadays we've got all kinds of materials that we didn't have in the 60s.
Yeah.
Capable of staving off radiation. We've got all kinds of tablets, all kinds of measuring.
Yeah.
Nobody came back with cancer.
No.
You know, nobody came back with burns. Nobody came back with stomach cancer or anything.
No, the astronauts that went all seem to have lived a full life.
7 missions with 3 people went through that thing twice, there and back, and nobody had a single problem. So why are NASA saying now they can't do it?
Yeah, it's a very interesting point.
Doesn't make any sense at all.
We're already making conclusions here.
Well, I don't think I think we're also weighing up. You see, the thing about it is in the 60s they might have just said do it. Nixon might have just said I don't give a fig, do it.
Yeah, you got to remember these astronauts are originally soldiers, and soldiers are expendable.
Well, they're test pilots, aren't they, in most part? But some of them are like Navy SEALs. I think some of them are sort of astroscientist guys, sort of guys that.
They were.
But the simple truth is, if Nixon said you've got to go, you're in the military, you've got to go.
Exactly. You're not going to say no to the president or your country.
Well, you
That
can't do
needs
it.
you.
You go.
Not in the period of the Cold War.
Well, you'd have been court-martialed
You're a traitor.
anyway.
You're a traitor.
Yeah, exactly. You know, that would have been bad press.
Bad enough.
They wouldn't even pick you unless they knew you were going to go. So I don't think that necessarily is can't do it, because nowadays it would be a court case. Back in those days, it would just been
Okay.
let's get another set of pilots.
It's unlikely, isn't it? I mean, the fact, like I just said earlier, the fact that we haven't sent any further manned missions outside of that Van Allen belt to do whatever mission that is, be it Moon, Mars, whatever. I don't recall humans in the shuttle or anything else going past that Van Allen
Here's a
belt.
story. I don't know if this is. I haven't actually looked into this, but I do remember that at one point they were sort of like the space shuttle was like 300 miles out, and they reported seeing stars even with their eyes closed, which they put down to radiation.
Right.
But once again, once you hit 11.2 kilometers a second, you're going to be through it in 1 minute.
Yeah, is that enough
Literally.
exposure to affect you in any adverse way? I mean, I don't know how radiation will affect the cells of a human body for a limited exposure time. When you get an X-ray, you're exposed to a level of radiation for a few seconds. People are still stepping out the room and standing behind barriers for that. So,
Well, that's a good point. But of course, that's electromagnetic radiation.
yes,
We're talking about every kind of radiation.
Everything.
We're talking about. Well, we're not talking about alpha and beta, but we're talking about solar wind and gamma. So cosmic rays, why?
Cosmic rays, yeah.
So that's electrons and protons, stuff
Yes.
like that, flying with incredible electron volt power that can do serious damage over millions of miles.
yeah. So it throws it's quite an established conspiracy theory, and it still holds quite a good argument, doesn't it?
Because it fits with everything.
Because
Once
it fits
again,
with everything, and we haven't gone back.
it fits with everything. All of modern NASA are basically saying we can't do this. And if you notice, the quality of people in NASA, in my opinion, has gone down and down and down. Because
Well, private industry's had something to say about that.
no, because all the good guys are in the real bloody space program.
Yes, the private
The one that
industry.
Kennedy-
The private industry.
The one that Kennedy was trying to get them to disclose.
Yes, that's where the smartest minds go. Shall we go on to another conspiracy theory, which is quite interesting, and I think comes up quite often, doesn't it?
Yeah, we've covered that. We think that they could have got there in Saturn V. I think we both agree on that. They could have got there in Saturn V.
It had the capability, and it had enough capacity and fuel to do that mission.
And I think they had the spacesuits, they had the LEM, The lem was a practical idea.
Yeah.
Everything was cleverly thought out. If you think about everything was the multi-stage thing. So as soon as they got into they basically, because the lem was on the front of the command module.
They weren't facing each other the right way, so they had to connect before they made the transit between Earth and the moon.
To break up and spin round and then redock. And all of that's a great idea.
Mm.
And then they get to the moon, they transfer 2 of them to the lem, they go down. Of course, you're using the main landing platform rocket at that point, which is a completely different fuel tank and rocket engine to the LEM itself. So you don't have to carry it back again. I mean, it all makes perfect sense. And then the LEM takes off by itself. Okay, the footage of it taking off is one of the dodgiest things I've ever seen in my entire life. It just looks like it's being winched up on a bit of string with a light bulb on the bottom. But once again, I think that's the segue for us to start talking about some of the footage.
I think we need to start getting into some of these other conspiracy theories. There is a famous one. Why are there no stars in the pictures of the NASA moon landings? Obviously, the camera technology back then wasn't its best, but at the same time, you've got to remember that the camera itself was focused purely for the astronauts and the spacecraft doing their experiments and their maneuvers on the surface. So it wouldn't be focused, firstly, to look at stars. And you have multiple light sources which will dampen the star. As you go into an evening, you notice that the blue sky turns purple, then darker. As it gets darker, you start to see stars. But the only reason you're not seeing stars and you see blue is because light is refracting off of Earth's atmosphere.
But of course, the moon doesn't have an atmosphere.
The moon doesn't have an atmosphere, but there are 2 sources of light. There is the sun and there's the Earth.
Okay, but so the Hasselblad camera, as you're talking,
yes,
is stuck to their chest and it's got to trigger fire. So you can't lean back because then you'll fall over and kill yourself. You know, you crack your helmet and you'll die or something.
Yeah.
So you couldn't take a picture upwards. So you can't get rid of the interference of the light on the earth, on the ground rather.
Right.
So you have to have the aperture small enough that the brightness of the moon below you doesn't completely and you can't see the stars. I've got absolutely no problem with that personally. No. I don't think you would be able to see unless you had a special, maybe if you'd taken the video, because they had a separate video camera, but the quality of it was absolutely terrible. But if you'd pointed that straight up and given it a minute to adjust, I mean, I don't know how the aperture worked on that thing, theoretically it maybe could have shot some stars. Maybe
it could have, but like I said earlier, you know, if the experiment is purely to test equipment and to see, you know, what the survival requirements are for humans to navigate the moon, then you're purely going to be filming videos on the actual spacesuits, how they're operating, the experiments you're performing, and there must be some artificial light coming from somewhere, from the ship or the actual astronaut itself, to shed light on these areas of interest, i.e. be it craters, be it so forth. So these cameras are kind of made for closer range capture than anything else.
It does make you wonder why they didn't have one that they put on like a mini telescope thing that took pictures of the stars.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the only chance you're ever going to get. We haven't got a single picture of the stars from the moon. They didn't think of it in one of any of the 7 missions, and they took a freaking buggy up there.
Yeah.
I mean, just imagine how cool a telescope that went click, click, click.
Well, you might as well left it on there, and then
and then, well, you've had to take the film or whatever with you, wouldn't you? That would have been fascinating. The pictures of Earth we could have had.
Yes, I know. Yeah.
I mean, there's that Earthrise shot, which is nice, but it doesn't show you. If it had a really good zoom, the pictures of Earth we could have had from the moon.
Yeah.
I mean, it's always in the same place because you're totally locked. It's the most perfect situation you could ever have.
Exactly, to observe Earth.
And they didn't take a single picture. It just seems such... I mean, looking back now, seems like a bit of a weird thing.
But I guess, like you said, they only had 8 years to plan it, so you can't think of anything. You can't think of everything.
But surely some of the astronomers must have gone, can we please...
They should have, shouldn't they, really?
You would have thought environmentally it would be incredibly valuable.
Yeah. Moving on to similar sort of thing, the shadows of the astronauts on the moon as they were walking around. I think we mentioned it earlier, but we didn't go into too much detail. But obviously, big questions about, well, these guys have got multiple shadows coming from multiple light sources. Now, that's not quite accurate. Yes, they do have multiple. You do see some footage of them manoeuvring and so forth. You see that there is a second light source that is producing another shadow, but that light source could be parallel light from a low orbiting sun. So if the sun's on the horizon, you would get a parallel sort of effect of shadows. Also, there is a second light source in the Earth itself. So that would also produce a smaller type of shadow coming from a different direction. So in my opinion, I don't see that there's much ground in that conspiracy theory. Because
I think you're absolutely right.
Because I think there's many explanations for having multiple shadows from different directions.
I think you're absolutely right. I think also that some people say the shadows aren't as dark as they should be. I don't really agree with that. The ground itself is incredibly bright in terms of the sun, the lack of atmosphere and everything above you. Even that shot that everyone goes on about where he's coming down the ladder and he's sort of lit from the bottom, I think that's exactly what the surface of the moon would have done.
Yeah.
You know, if you've got the aperture turned up so much, down so much that you've only really got black and white, I think that's pretty much what you'd see.
The problem is we have no base to base this from. We have no.
It's so hard to imagine
data.
What something without an atmosphere. What would this room look like if there was no air? How would the light be cast? It would be just so completely different.
Yeah, in a vacuum, obviously many different effects would happen.
I've just got no basis. I've got nothing to base it on.
Exactly. So I think it's a non-starter. And
I think it is a very difficult.
Should we go to another one?
Absolutely.
The other famous one is that the Apollo 11 US flag is waving in the wind, but there's no wind on the moon. So
some of the shots are genuinely weird.
Yeah.
If you look at some of David Percy, I think he did one about the moon, but he does have some of the footage with the flag blowing, which does look genuinely weird. It's like it's literally going like this and they're sort of trying to grab it, and you're thinking, well,
first of all, it's not a normal flag. Let's start with that. It's a pole with a 90-degree rod coming out the side of it, which the flag then obviously connected to the top rod and the side rod. So it was supported by two poles in a sense, with the bottom corner flapping.
Because of course, in no atmosphere,
it's not going to fly.
It's not going to fly. It's. I mean, you've got to ask yourself why you would take a flag. You know, they didn't take a telescope, but they took a flag.
But that in itself says to me, you're saying that a flag waving, that's almost by design. They wanted you to see a flag that looked like it was waving, so you would put an L-shaped flagpole and hang it off of that. Because
isn't it interesting that was their focus? Stick a flag in it. It's ours.
Well, it's the Cold War.
You know,
American pride.
That was their major focus. Was people sitting at home going, yes,
yeah.
You Ruskies, have that in the backside.
I don't buy into this conspiracy theory for the simple reason that the flag was designed to look like it was waving in space. The design of it, by its concept, was to look like a flag.
They faked it. They faked it in a TV studio. They didn't fake it in the middle of the desert, in my opinion. So, how could the wind be blowing on it? When you think about the metal hook thing that keeps it sort of erect, that's just as useful in a TV studio as it is.
It doesn't matter if you have gravity or atmosphere or not. It works because it's a 90.
But what I mean is, so it works just as well in a TV studio as it would on the moon. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
It kind of makes it irrelevant. So yeah, let's move on to the next one.
If we really went to the moon in 1969, why have we never been back? And we've mentioned this a number of times in this discussion with the Van Allen belt and so forth. If we made this amazing feat of human history happen in real life, then surely we cut the path for other scientists and explorers to go and do exactly the same thing or something similar.
The first thing to say about that is no disclosed missions.
Yes.
And you're talking about human missions. There have been all kinds of robotic missions to the moon.
Yes.
Now, of course, that falls into the Van Allen radiation belt problem because it only stops humans. The Van Allen radiation belt doesn't stop the GPS satellites.
No, that's right.
Because they're through it, and they made it through.
Yeah.
But it does stop people. Once again, we're back to the same thing. In the 60s, they might have just said, get on with it, I don't care. It's a confusing one, because if they sent 21 people through it and back, surely that means they could do it again.
Yes, exactly, and why haven't they?
Nobody got anything. So, I mean, that is a confusing one to me.
I think it's the strongest one in my opinion.
It could be that they came across something in the moon missions that meant they couldn't go back?
Well, we could take that rabbit hole, a little touch on that rabbit hole, Dive, because that's a very deep rabbit hole. We're talking structures on the moon. We're talking a civilization on the moon, or a lost civilization, or a breakaway civilization that have gone onto the moon. I.e., some people theorise that the Nazi Party already on the dark side of the moon. They had aspirations to go and set up a moon base there, and so forth. It's very far-fetched.
Of course, Viracocha, the sort of Graham Hancock kind of people.
Yes.
The 13,000 years ago, before Göbekli Tepe, they might have gone there. It certainly sounds like they had the technology to do so. They might have made a deal with some off-world people and just be keeping it last. Who knows?
Yeah.
But it's a really tricky thing to get past, that NASA don't seem to have the wherewithal to go back. What does that mean? I mean, to me, that just points back to the whole Kennedy thing, that there is a technological elite, and they just don't want anyone going anywhere near the moon because they've got all kinds of stuff going on the other side of it. They've just got loads of stuff. It's the perfect thing for them.
Well, if you're going to be a breakaway civilization that's more technically advanced than your parent race, then you would want to isolate yourself away from the Earth and keep these secrets secret.
Sure, but it wouldn't necessarily be a breakaway. So it could literally be, once you've got a base there with people, because I mean, once you've got cracked anti-gravity like they were after in the 50s, and just to talk about that for 1 second, a huge amount of the way physics has gone now is from a man called Ed Witten, W-I-T-T-E-N, or Witten, of course he's German, really. His father was an anti-gravity scientist from McDonnell Douglas in the 50s, and yet he's come out in the sort of 80s and 90s and taken physics down string theory. Now, string theory is mathematically fascinating, but in terms of actual useful, it's got no reason to be. It's kind of almost taken everyone away from
I see where
his dad was.
I see where you're going with this.
It's almost like he was an implant, like a misinformation
He was
agent.
there to steer academics away from studying certain technologies and theories that would lead to anti-gravitics or sustainable energy.
Or even getting further down relativity road, basically.
Yes. So what you do, you create an avenue for scientists to go down that leads to nowhere.
Well, he didn't create it. He just... What he really did was come up with mathematics that was just so blindingly exciting and amazing for everybody. They were all like, oh, wow, let's go that way. Yeah. Because obviously him and his off-world buddies had been thinking about it for 2 generations on top of everyone else.
But more than thinking about it, they've been utilising it.
They might even have freaking supercomputers, quantum computers we can't even imagine about that. Who knows? And they basically came up with stuff a couple of generations down the line that's so exciting to everybody. They went that way without thinking, well, are we really thinking about...
It's a dead end.
What gravity is?
Yes. How does this better our understanding of the universe?
Yes.
Theoretically, we're thinking along those lines, but we're not actually getting any solid answers.
Some scientists, of people like if you can call John Harrison a scientist, a lot of people refuse to do that, but the Canadian guy, people who do experiments and seem to be able to do things where they can disrupt gravity with electromagnetic radiation and magnetism. Now, according to Einstein, that's completely impossible, but he can make a cannonball float just by mucking about with emissions of electromagnetic radiation and magnetic fields. Now, if that's really true, that you can affect
matter,
affect gravity is what you're really, or at least the pull of gravity on various things. That means that gravity probably isn't necessarily about the bending of space-time. It's just the way we're thinking about it now. It could be on a spectrum of force right next to magnetism. The simple truth is, I've seen that experiment on video, of course. Now, I don't know exactly how he's doing it, but that cannonball floats. He gets metal to warp. He is creating forces on stuff. Even if he's not disrupting gravity, if he's creating some other force, it doesn't matter how he's achieving it. It's a way to get to the moon. Yeah. And if you can get, let's just say you took something like a nuclear submarine technology. So you've got energy, you've got air, you're recycling water. If you could get something that big onto the moon...
Your only limitation is food and water.
Your only limitation is food. Exactly. And just like Matt Damon does in the
Martian. Yeah.
Once you start using your poop as Earth, you can do pretty much anything.
Yeah.
Of course, if you could get tunnelling equipment up there, you wouldn't have to worry about radiation.
No, you can base yourself underground.
Start getting underground.
Yeah.
You've got no restrictions. There's no laws about what dynamite you could put a nuke underground.
Yeah.
And just set it off, and you'd have a huge. It doesn't matter about the radiation because you're wearing radiation-proof stuff anyway. You can just fill the thing with 10 meters of water afterwards. You could literally melt a massive underground space with a hydrogen bomb.
It's a good theory.
You wouldn't. The radiation would never get through the moon to us for us to detect it.
No.
There's just so much you could do if you had something that overcomes gravity with electromagnetics or whatever. You're gone, man.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, I think we've touched on the main conspiracy theories. For one little conspiracy theory I've always had is that famous photo of the lander launching from the base and the camera following it up.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know who had the level of technology to remotely control a camera.
They do a good job, though, don't they? They get it exactly right every time.
Yeah, to follow it all the way up. That just doesn't make sense to me.
Well,
I don't think the technology existed to do
but
that.
once again, that's just about the footage. It's like the letter on the rock on the moon, where they find the C on the. Now, first of all, I just don't bother. I don't believe you'd bother marking your props. A, B, C, D. You're trying to make a moon. You can need more than A to Z.
Yeah, you get it. Yeah.
that's very tricky. I mean, the lunar lander one to me just doesn't look like a real rocket.
No.
It doesn't accelerate. It literally looks like something being winched up on a bit of string.
I think it was some sort of canister burst or something to initially launch it from the lander, then the rocket engaged. So it must have been some sort of compressed air launch, and then the rocket ignites as it goes 20 meters up from the lander.
Pretty risky way to do it, because if the rocket didn't come in, you'll just fall back down and fall off. Now that's it. You're finished. You can't set the rocket off anymore. Maybe that's what happened. I don't know about that. I'd always just assume the rocket fired straight away. But this brings us on to the crater problem.
Yes.
Let's face it, the gravity is 1/6. Now that is impossible to imagine. So you would literally be, when you dropped a can of beans like
it would
this one
bounce
I've
up
got
and
here,
down for you.
it would literally be like it was underwater, sinking. That's what it would look like.
It'd be slower, actually.
It would just be absolutely, except of course it would keep accelerating. It wouldn't be like being underwater. The acceleration would be so slow. When I look at the crater problem, you could have cut the rocket early enough to not have a crater, I think.
Yeah, for the audience, can you just go over your initial, what the actual overall theory is?
Okay, so the theory is that when the 5,000 pounds, which is over 2 tons of thrust, 2.5 tons of thrust in American imperial system, so that should have sent dust everywhere. Now, if you watch it when they land out of the window, it does appear to send dust everywhere from quite a long way up, and as far as I can tell from the video, it appears to keep sending dust until they touch down. But it's very difficult to make out the ground and the distance because the picture is absolutely terrible.
Yeah.
So they could have shut the rocket off. Let's just say they shut it off 4 feet above the ground. How quickly you'd have accelerated that last 4 feet, I don't think it would have mattered. So to me, I don't think the crater's a reasonable argument.
No, and they didn't come down. They didn't descend vertically. They kind of were going at an angle when they initially touched down. You see them moving towards something, not as if they're going down towards it, but like a horizontal sort of movement, a linear sort of movement across as they're landing, like a normal aircraft glides onto the runway. This was gliding into the crater as well, and I didn't see.
Which doesn't really make any sense.
Yeah.
When you think about it, that doesn't really make any sense at all. But once again, that's just a problem with the footage. It doesn't mean they didn't land.
Are there any other conspiracy theories that you can come up with? I think we covered most of them.
Crosses disappearing behind objects in the photos, aren't there?
Oh, right.
When they have those crosses to sort of show...
Oh, yes.
Now,
to do measurements by and so forth.
And they appear to be behind. Now, I don't know how you could achieve that under any circumstances.
No.
Because those marks are not on the film.
They're physically on the lens.
So, no matter how bright something was, I mean, maybe if it was sunlight bright, I suppose it might. It's all about contrast.
It's quite an obscure conspiracy theory. It's nothing that can disprove or prove anything. What else have we got?
The astronauts and how they move.
Oh yes, a very good point.
You know,
Glad you brought that up.
The first thing to say, the first problem is, of course, some video evidence seems to suggest there were wires in those videos, that the astronauts were suspended.
Yeah. So you're referring to what people will commonly know as the bunny hopping across, which kind of lends to the fact that there was some level of support.
You see a glint of light or something way too high up to be the aerial.
Yeah.
Which is very odd.
I mean, obviously we need to address the fact that the actual spacesuit itself would have been naturally restrictive due to the fact that it had liquid cooling in it, multiple layers, must have had some sort of metallic structure to it to keep it formed. So that will naturally, in itself, by nature, give it a restrictive movement. Your normal twisting of a pelvis, or you wouldn't have full movement of your elbows or your knees. So in itself, by nature, it would have been a restrictive suit.
In other words, if they filmed that on Earth, there's no way they could film it unless they were suspended from wires. The gravity, you never could have moved. No way.
You shouldn't have been able to move, really.
Those things weighed 180 pounds. So that's about 70 kilos. Just imagine wearing a suit that weighs 70 kilos on Earth.
It's, yeah. You're not going to be in it for very long, and you're not going to be able to do much.
You would literally be...
They don't even make SAS troops or Navy SEALs carry that amount of weight when they're doing their exercises for training.
Doubling your body, your body weight.
Yeah.
You know, so that would be like having a fridge freezer, a full, proper sized one with freezer and fridge, everything in it, probably full of stuff.
Yeah, you'd be wearing the fridge and just your legs poking out the bottom, basically.
Well, even your legs would have sort of bits of fridge on them.
Yeah.
It'd be almost completely impossible to move.
Yeah.
It would probably kill you.
Yeah.
Unless you were on wires. So that to me is kind of a 50-50 one. It's a bit like...
It's a good argument, isn't it?
It's a bit like the space journey one. Okay, they could have gone, but then of course we need to talk about the Bart Sabrell "a funny thing happened on the way to the moon" thing, where they appear to be faking being 130,000 miles away from Earth by putting a circular bit of dark
cloud around the Earth to make it look like the Earth's at a further distance away than it actually is.
Exactly.
No stars in it either kind of comes into play, and that's interesting because you're in space there. There's no excuse for you not to have.
Exactly. The only light source is Earth. Okay, Earth is bright. And if they were really 130,000 miles away, that's a long way. Okay, it would be significantly brighter than the moon from here to us. But you've got to bear in mind that all that light's got to go through the atmosphere and then come back again. So I would have thought you should be able to see stars in that situation. And of course the other big problem with that picture is that none of the land is identifiable. It's just a sort of swirly...
No.
The clouds are way too big.
Yeah, the clouds seem to cover whole continents.
Exactly.
Whereas that's not really how it
That's
works.
not how it works.
Unless you have a...
There's no North Pole, there's no South Pole, there's no equator. It just looks completely...
The axis of the Earth looks odd as well.
Exactly.
The way it rotates, so
and the
does lend
actual...
to that theory.
The shape of it.
Is there not a video clip on that documentary that shows the actual astronauts moving the camera away from the window?
We will cut as much of that in as we can, but I think that that is pretty damning evidence.
Yeah.
You know, to me, that is possible proof they couldn't go through the Van Allen radiation belt. Because if that is really what Bart Sabrell claims it to be, then that is them faking the moon mission from low Earth orbit. And if that's true, then every single part of the moon video and photograph stuff is as fake as it looks.
Yes.
And it makes you realise that when people like Elon Musk say stuff like, it must be real because it looks so fake. Well, who's he covering up for there when he says stuff like that? The whole thing is so highly questionable.
So what is your conclusion?
Well, I think I want to talk about laser reflectors for a minute.
Oh, well, the laser reflector, another good point.
Now, I want you to visualise, and I'll try and put this on the screen when I'm talking about this. I want you to visualise an isosceles triangle from the Earth to the Moon. So we're talking about firing a laser, right?
Hundreds of kilometres.
From Earth, which is spinning. Now, that's spinning at the same time as the moon is spinning relatively, so you've got the same face of the moon, but it's not spinning at the same time the moon is revolving around the Earth. The moon is orbiting the Earth.
Yeah, the moon.
It's not a stationary target. No. It's moving at about 1 kilometre a second, right? Now, these people claim, and I can watch this on Mythbusters, that they fire from Earth. I think they've got a few different lasers they use, and you can look up the position of the 3 or 4 different laser reflectors from NASA put there. Now, these laser reflectors are 650 by 1,000 millimeters, so they're 65% of a square meter, right? So they would quite easily fit on your bedside cabinet.
Tiny in comparison.
It's basically a breakfast tray. That's what you're talking about. It is a breakfast tray.
So you are shooting a laser from Earth to
384,000 kilometres.
384,000 kilometres.
Think of an isosceles triangle.
Something the size of an A3 piece of paper.
Where the base is 650 millimetres. And the sides are 384 billion millimetres. That angle is the angle subtended to the accuracy you would have to hit a moving target with a laser in 1969.
Moving a kilometre a second.
So, to me,
unlikely.
Even if you take into account the fact that the laser doesn't remain completely parallel, and by the time it gets to the moon it's about 1.5 kilometres wide, it's possible you'd be able to hit it, but you'd have so much light coming back from the surface of the 1.5 kilometre circle around the reflector, which would just be a tiny little pinprick. How would you ever measure that?
Yeah.
Why would you ever put it there?
What refraction would you get back from that?
It's just such a bizarre idea, and yet it's one of the things that most people drop as their ace card to say, actually.
Yeah, but they don't actually understand the distances and the science involved in actually making that work.
That triangle is such a bizarre idea. And even if you hit the reflector it's because it's gone across the whole 1.5 kilometres in 1.5 seconds. And yet when you see them do it on TV, they get a blah, 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 3 seconds back. Well, how are you doing that?
Yeah.
What, you're moving the laser at 1.0067 times 10 to the minus 7 degrees. That's the accuracy you're talking about.
What's the possibility of them having a laser that's right next to the reflector that turns on to show a sign? Turns on remotely.
Well, you need something on the moon.
Yes. That's more viable.
Well, I think you wouldn't do that. You just literally put a laser.
Put a light on. Put a laser to cover
back.
Yeah.
But then you'd have to hit the people on Earth, which is just as difficult. Because that's the problem with this thing. Is not only have you got to hit it with the laser, the light's got to get back to you.
I'm just trying to explore all possibilities here, so we can try and see if the likelihood of this, which from what you're saying or from what I'm thinking, it's very unlikely.
You'd have to have a colossally powerful laser. I've got to ask the question: what would happen if you accidentally hit the remaining fuel in the lunar lander base?
But you have to have a massive reflector as well. Really.
I mean, to me, even if it was like a computer-controlled thing and you could angle it to fire all the light back at you, I still think it would be impossible to hit the target. From every way I look at that, it just seems like something somebody added as a whistleblow, and they didn't realise until it was too late, so they had to swallow it.
Yeah.
Because it makes no sense. There are a couple of strange things. Okay, so first of all, the buggy.
Oh God, yes.
Now, from every single way I look at the buggy, there's so many things you could have taken to do some really interesting experiments. The only thing that the buggy is useful for is being on TV for kids. Now, I can understand why you do that as NASA, because, as they say in Apollo 13. So after Apollo 12, they said they made going to the moon about as interesting as a trip to Pittsburgh in the papers. Now, that means that NASA had to get people excited again. And miraculously, something blew up on Apollo 13, but somehow it destroyed all the power and made it into a massive drama.
Get the nation behind the astronauts.
A huge drama of, oh my God, everyone's going to die. And suddenly everyone was interested in it again.
Yeah.
That is unbelievably unlikely. isn't it? It's just unbelievably unlikely that something like that fell into NASA's lap and got everyone interested again. That was the only significant problem they ever had.
Yeah. The odds are so far. Yeah. The achievement is just so difficult to pull off 6-7 times.
So 13 went. So then everyone was interested again in 14, but by 15, they had to bring the buggy in. I mean, when you look at it again, it just fits.
Yeah.
It fits with the Kennedy thing.
Yeah.
They had to try and keep people interested because they had to pretend
that this is the best technology we have, and we're making amazing achievements.
Exactly, that Kennedy had been fulfilled, and he hadn't just been murdered by a bunch of lunatics on the other side of the moon who wanted to keep all the money and keep communism at bay and have a Vietnam War because they wanted the share prices and all the rest of it. It just fits when you look at that. I think that is the thing that worries me, is it just seems to fit with the world we've wound up in today. It feels like the beginning of the evil that we live in today. That's what it feels like, doesn't it?
Yeah. The wool has been pulled over the inhabitants of
when they got away with the moon landing,
by all these different
they realised they could get away with anything.
Yeah, that opened the door to let's see how far we can push this.
I think there are problems with the idea of cooling the spacecraft, particularly with Apollo 13. If you think about leaving your dog in the car when you go into a football match in the middle of summer, or sorry, let's say a cricket match in the middle of summer, if he's in the car for 3 hours with the windows shut, he's dead.
He's dead, yeah.
That is an aluminium container with windows, which is exactly what the astronauts were in. It is exactly what they were in. An aluminium container, airtight, with windows. Now, a car's not airtight, and it has the atmosphere to convect heat away from it. These guys were in direct sunlight. Sunlight like you've never experienced on Earth. They had no atmospheric protection. They had no magnetic field to protect them. They were in direct sunlight for 9 days straight, apart from a tiny bit of time when they went around the backside of the moon.
Interesting.
They had an ice sublimator. Now, an ice sublimator is something that sort of sprinkles ice on the deck of the ship, that then the heat sublimates. In other words, it goes, because there's no air pressure for a liquid's phase, it goes straight from a solid to a gas, and that disseminates on heat. Now, we both know that they couldn't carry much ice.
And why would you want to mix any sort of liquid with primitive electronics that could absolutely go wrong?
Well, I mean, as I say, it was on the outside anyway.
Yeah.
And it was probably distilled water, so it probably wasn't a very big worry for the electronics. But they couldn't have carried enough to keep spraying it for 9 days straight.
No,
it just
not
doesn't.
For a whole mission.
You might as well have made it out of lead.
With fuel.
Exactly.
Water, experiments.
Exactly.
Humans, waste. Yeah, it just kind of doesn't add up.
It doesn't really add up.
No.
I mean, to me, the heat problem.
It's a good point.
Is a significant
good point. There's no natural protection there.
Just to be completely clear, while they're on the launch pad, they plug in an external air conditioner. Otherwise, they get too hot, and that's before they've even got out of the atmosphere.
Yeah.
To me, that is a really big question. There's no air. You can't have an air conditioner in space. You've got nowhere outside.
I mean, I think you've raised some really fantastic arguments here, and you've opened my eyes certainly to some of these conspiracies actually having some legs. And once you talk about it with put a critical mind towards it, the more and more I get the impression that this just couldn't have happened.
The question about the buggy, not only is it just a TV, what would you use it for? If you drive it 2 kilometres away and the battery runs out.
Yeah. So obviously they wanted to extend the range of the astronauts being able to do experiments around the lunar lander and kind of explore around near the vicinity of the lander. Just obviously because, like you said, if you ran out of battery and the thing, you couldn't walk back on the amount of air you had. Mind you, there could have been an air supply on the actual buggy itself, so in that sort of sense the astronaut would have had a little bit more time to survive. Maybe they could have recharged the air supply before they'd have to traverse back by foot if the battery did run out. So there must have been some level of contingency there. I don't see any other purpose of the buggy other than to extend the range of the astronauts to do experiments. That's the only reason you'd have it.
To me, the buggy, you could have replaced the buggy with a foldable 10 metre by 10 metre reflector, something really useful, you could have replaced the buggy with a massive telescope.
Yeah.
You know, it had huge batteries in it. It must have done to move people around like that. This was the 60s.
Yeah.
The battery technology in the 60s, they didn't have lithium ion, I don't think. But then again, battery technology has always been very slow moving. It just seems like something to keep the kids interested for the last 3 missions. So, where does all of this leave us? The problem is, there's so much motivation to fake it.
Yeah.
That's the problem.
If you were trying to send a statement to the world by showing them that you have these capabilities and that you can achieve it and pull it off, you can't fail, can you? You're just not allowed to fail, because the minute you do fail, your whole society and all your ideals collapse around you. Because
excellent point. Let's face it, it was Nixon. Would Nixon have risked, as we know, it wasn't live behind the Iron Curtain in China or Russia, but it was live the whole world. So the Russians would have known. If they'd screwed it up, it would have been on Russian TV in 2 minutes.
Yeah.
They would have been rolling around in a vodka festival for 2 years.
Yeah.
If they'd blown up on the launch pad, in orbit, if anything had happened, the Russians would have absolutely been all
jumped
over
on it, wouldn't they?
So how could you not have a pre-recorded video backup?
Contingency plan. Yeah.
And if you were going to do that, you'd have to have a guarantee that you'd have Armstrong, Aldrin and Collins at the press conference.
Yeah.
You had to have a guarantee.
They had to return on their first mission.
So it's interesting to think that they even sent them up there at all. Because if Saturn V had blown up on the launch pad, that would have been
up.
Okay, even if the astronauts had escaped with the escape velocity thing, which they might well have done, because it has a sort of chute thing that they can sort of slide out. But if those pictures of them faking 130,000 miles away from Earth that Bart Sobral suggests they are true, and it certainly looks pretty convincing, we'll look at it again. But if that's really true, then they went into space and low Earth orbit for 9 days.
9 days and just then returned.
And then just came back in. I mean,
that was the highest risk of it, the launch and the return.
To me, that seems pretty
plausible, isn't it?
Plausible.
Definitely plausible.
So it wasn't nothing. It was a risky thing they undertook to do even that. I just find it very hard to believe that Nixon would have taken that level of risk. And that it's only really Bart Sobral's movie, every single other part of the moon conspiracy, and maybe the heating of the aircraft, every single other part of it, I think, is pretty much debunkable.
Yeah, you can argue it.
I think that without very recent, and maybe the laser reflectors are a bit odd, but even that I could be convinced of. You know, if you said, oh, well, we get a spike here, it's possible with today's sensors and stuff. I don't know why you'd have put it, maybe you put it there in 69 in the hope you'd have better stuff in the future. It seems a bit odd that the Russians did it too.
I mean, is there anything else, any other points that we haven't touched on?
I would say that I'm 60% they didn't go.
Is that your conclusion?
I'm just going to say that as a number.
Okay.
I can't think that
any other rationale behind that?
I can't think that there's anything we haven't covered. Oh, well, maybe there's one more thing to mention. It's the telemetry. They lost every part of the data.
Oh yes, NASA have said that they no longer are in possession of any of the data because it was lost.
Now, that is the same. It's like saying I invented anti-gravity last night, but I lost a bit of paper. Yeah. That's how ridiculous it is.
Yeah.
What do you mean you lost it?
Yeah. The most important mission in that department's history, and you've lost
the information you had to get back to the freaking moon. You haven't got anymore.
But not only that data, because not only would you study that as an engineer and learn how your machine has operated within different sort of environments and so forth, but you take that information and you improve on it.
But how many copies of it would you have anyway?
Exactly. Why wouldn't you have copies of it?
Surely you'd be putting it onto the latest version of everything. Because the whole thing to me makes no sense. Are they saying they actually lost the data? Or just the original tapes?
They specify the telemetry data. obviously they wouldn't have lost all the data because we have footage, but they've lost the actual computerized telemetry, which would given the numbers, which would given which would given the readings of the levels of gravity, would have given the readings of the atmosphere outside, the speeds, the gravitational pulls, those sort of things that could disprove your theory if they were fake.
Maybe they do still have data, copies. I can't believe they lost all of it. That's just ridiculous.
Then why say have?
But surely they would have been studying it for the last 50 years anyway.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know what to say about that. It just seems.
I mean, so you've given us your conclusion in regards to it being your 60-40 that they didn't go.
That's what I'm saying. I would say that in light of the evidence we've looked at today, it was 50-50 up until we got to the Bart video, the heating problem, and I think the Apollo 13 thing is so sus.
Yeah. I mean, for me, obviously, one of the main things for me is that we can only make our assumptions and our position known from what we have been told and what we can see with our own two eyes. So we are at the mercy of what they have fed us. And if what they have fed us doesn't make much sense, then surely it leads you to the conclusion that there's something awry here. Because...
Okay, I think this is a really important point to make. Because let's go back to that Bart Zabral video. Somebody sent him that by mistake, in inverted commas. Or somebody sent him that who wants more and more people who might be thinking about what's really on the far side of the moon to be worried about whether or not we landed on it in the first place. The whole moon landing is so confusing.
Yeah.
It's a black hole for time.
It just asks more questions than it ever answers, and that's NASA in a nutshell. They like to muddy the waters because that's how they operate. They can operate in a world of grey much easier than they can operate in an open world where everything is explainable and everyone is accountable. So, yeah, there's too many grey areas for me to come to a conclusion or for me to even say I believed it happened, because as it stands, I have to say I don't believe it happened because I have too many questions.
I think the best way to describe what we've come to the conclusion of tonight is that NASA is a cover-up. That's what NASA is. It's not covering stuff up. It is a cover-up. It is a cover-up because the real space program began before NASA even existed. And the whole of Operation Paperclip was just something running alongside. I mean, that's the other question that we'll have to do a show on, is Nazi technology about anti-gravity. They were definitely looking into it in the 40s.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of very interesting discussions we're going to have in the future. I mean, Project Moondust is another really interesting one, of the crash retrieval of Russian spacecraft and possibly other types of craft. There's many different topics kind of orbiting around this topic, i.e. the moon landing. With that, I think we should just draw to a conclusion, and thank you everyone for spending the time to listen to us, and we hope to see you again in the future.